Okay, so before we can do math, I lied to you. Before we can do math, we need to talk about terms. I am going to be using a lot of lingo while we're talking about this stuff, but it's very important lingo, and it's probably stuff that you've already heard before. And it might be stuff that makes the math seem more intimidating than it really is, because you already are like not really sure about the math, and then you see all these words you don't know and you're like, oh my gosh. And so then it just turns into a whole thing. And that's how it was for me when I started. So before we get into the numbery nitty-gritty parts, let's kind of dispel the mystery behind some of these words that you keep hearing and seeing. And the first one that we need to talk about is a very important one, and it is dent. You'll see this a lot. It is French and Romance languages, really, for tooth. There's debate whether or not it actually means the actual thing itself or the space in between, but essentially what it is on a reed, like a stainless steel reed, you're going to have all of these tiny little spaces with all of these little like metal pieces in between, and those spaces are what we call our dents. How we get our dent size, you hear that a lot too, is by counting those, and we're going to talk about that in a second. In the same breath, if you're working on a rigid heddle loom, your dent is going to be either the slot or the hole that we're talking about. And it's not exactly correct, but it's close enough for our purposes that it's going to make sense in just a minute, because we're going to talk about something else. Okay, so we just talked about dent. Let's look at another thing that relates really, really closely to that specifically. You're going to see this a lot. EPI, or ends per inch. So when you're looking at your reed or rigid heddle, to figure out how many dents per inch, DPI, it's not as important as the other two, to figure out how many dents per inch or how many ends you can fit in that space, you count those slots. So in your stainless steel reed, you'll be counting 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way in a space in an inch to see how many of those you have. Let's say we have 10. On a rigid heddle, if we have a 10 dent heddle, we're going to count 5 slots and 5 holes, 1 slot, 1 hole, 1 slot, 1 hole, and so on until we get to an inch and see how many we have in there. Maybe we have 10, maybe we have 8, maybe we have 5. It just depends on whatever reed or rigid heddle you have. Ends per inch is how many individual strands of yarn you can fit in those spaces. So in this case, there are situations where your ends per inch may be, say, double what your dent size is. So maybe you have a 10 dent reed, but you've threaded it up for 20 ends per inch. That's a little bit more complicated than what we're going to be talking about throughout the whole workshop that we're doing. So bear in mind that that's something that's possible, but don't really worry about it too much right now. That'll come to you later, after you learn all this other stuff. Then you can take that and you can expand upon it on your own. But ends per inch, the very important part about this is this word right here. Ends refers to specifically the individual strands of yarn in your project in your warp. So, bearing in mind that we just spoke about warp, maybe let's talk about that. Okay, so what is warp? We just talked about ends per inch and how that relates to your warp specifically, and you hear this word a lot. Warp specifically refers to the yarn that goes on your loom, that is dressed on the loom. Dressed is something you hear a lot too. So these are the ones that you wind on your warping board, or if you're a rigid heddler, you can do it from your loom onto a peg, back and forth, direct warping. You can do it on a mill if you're on floor loom or table loom. This part is the part that you're going to thread through your reed or rigid heddle, through your heddles if you have a reed, and then wind onto your back beam, ready for weaving, basically. Alright, so we just talked about warp and EPI. Let's talk about the other half. This is a whole other half of yarn that you're going to need to complete your project. So picks per inch is in reference specifically to your weft, which we'll talk about in a second, and how many picks or passes back and forth of your shuttle that you have in an inch. This can be the same as your EPI. This can be different than your EPI. Doesn't matter. It's totally up to you, whatever you want to do. But that is what picks refers to. When you hear the word picks, it's always talking about the number of picks in your weft. So, what is weft? Okay, so we sort of halfway answered this in the last one, but let's talk about it by itself anyway. You see this word a lot. There are actually other words that people use for it as well. You'll hear woof sometimes. You'll hear all kinds of different words that sound sort of like this, and they all specifically refer to the yarn that goes back and forth. So like we said with warp, that is the part that gets dressed on the loom, right? The weft is the part that you're passing back and forth on your shuttle. So that's what weft is. Warp and weft constantly working together to make your project. Okay, so we just talked about warp and weft. We talked about ends per inch and picks per inch, and I mentioned the word balanced. And you'll see balance a lot in weaving as well. There's merit to having a balanced weave structure, right? And by which I mean that your ends per inch, let's just say it's 10, just for fun, is the same as your picks per inch, which should also be 10. It isn't to say that is how it should always be, but it is something that in plain weave and in most balanced twills, 2/2 for example, that people try and shoot for. It makes for something that behaves in a very predictable way, I guess is the best way to describe it, but that doesn't mean that you should always be doing things in a balanced way. There are going to be reasons that you decide not to. That's, again, a little bit more than what we'll be talking about in terms of how to calculate for that and that sort of thing in this workshop, but it's worth mentioning and worth thinking about. So balance, as we're going to talk about it, if you hear me talking about it in this workshop, it's to say that your ends per inch and your picks per inch are the same number. Okay, last piece of lingo before we get on to the rest of it is loom waist or thrums. There may be other things that people are out here calling that, and that's fine, but these are the words that I use most often and that I hear most often, so these are the ones we're going to talk about. Loom waist or thrums is the part of your warp that you cannot weave, no matter how hard you try. There are going to be knots that connect you from the, to the front or the back, or loops if you do it that way. There's going to be, how when you advance your warp to that point where your knots are almost hitting the back of your heddle and your shed is like this big and you just can't squeeze your shuttle through that? That part that you just cannot weave at the end is your loom waist or thrums. There is really no way to get around that. If you're really lucky and you want to have fringe on your project, this is perfect for that. If you don't want to have fringe on your project though, you're just going to have some unwoven bits at the end that you're just going to have to deal with. Rather, you're just going to have to be okay with the fact that they end up on the floor at the end of it. It's just how it works. But in any case, when I talk about loom waist and thrums and why we're calculating for that, that's what that means and what I'm talking about. So, now that we've talked about lingo, it's time for some math.